Do you know what the greatest mystery in the history of religions is? Well, it happens to be found in the gospel passage that is used in many churches, probably the majority of churches throughout the world, for this Sunday, the second Sunday of Easter. So this past Sunday. It's the story, the famous story of doubting Thomas. You know the story. Thomas is not with the other disciples when Jesus first appears to them. So when they tell him about Jesus appearing, Thomas basically says that he won't believe it unless, and it's kind of crude in the Greek, unless he can take his fist and thrust it up the side of Jesus, the wound in his side, unless he can take his hand and put it in the nail marks in the wrists of Jesus. They wouldn't have been in his hand, but his wrist. And then take his fist and literally throw it into the side of Jesus. Well, a week later, Jesus shows up and proves himself to Thomas. Thomas obviously didn't expect that Jesus would do that. He didn't think Jesus was really risen. So he is standing there in shock and awe, overwhelmed by the presence of Jesus. And Jesus, instead of reprimanding him, tells Thomas, go ahead. If that's what you need, see and believe. Don't persist in your unbelieving. That's kind of the sense of the Greek, literally. Don't persist in your unbelieving, but believe. And if you need to, take your hand and put it into my wrist, the wounds in my wrist, and your fist, and thrust it up my side. Obviously, Thomas doesn't need to do that at that point. But at that point, he confesses to Jesus, my Lord and my God. Of all the human beings in the Gospels, no one has a more perfect or profound confession of faith than Thomas. Nobody gets Jesus more fully than Thomas does. The Greek words for Lord and God, for God it's theos, which translates El or Elohim from the Hebrew. That's kind of like a generic name for God, like God's job description. It's a reference to the fact that God is the Almighty, that God is sovereign over all, the creator of all the universe. And in fact, that term could apply to pagan gods as well. It's just kind of a very generic way of addressing God, but it's universal. It kind of encapsulates all the ways that people understand the nature of God as the sovereign over all, the creator of all that is. Lord translates Adonai. Adonai was the substitute word that Jews used for Yahweh, for the sacred name, the divine name that God reveals to Moses in the burning bush. For Jews, that's profoundly personal, because they believe that a name kind of expressed a person's identity. So when God reveals his name to Moses in the burning bush, he's revealing his very nature and essence, his identity. It's an intimate and personal way of revealing himself to Israel. So by doubling these two names up, these two major titles that Jews used for God, Adonai and Elohim in the Greek translation, what Thomas is doing essentially is giving as complete or full a confession of Jesus as God as there can be. In other words, there's no more profound confession of faith than what Thomas makes here with Jesus. There's no more profound way of capturing who Jesus really is, his divine nature. And there is no other human being in the four Gospels who has as full, as robust, as magnified a confession of faith as Thomas. And that's the greatest mystery in the history of religions. How is it that Thomas and the other disciples, almost immediately in the wake of Jesus' death, after his humiliating crucifixion, come to confess him as the Lord of all? These are fiercely monotheistic Jews. The thing that they believe that's most essential to their worldview is that God is one. They believe in the uniqueness of God, the absolute otherness, the transcendence of God. So it's unthinkable to them that God could become a human being, or that God would be more than one, Father and Son, and eventually they would understand, the Christian church would understand the Holy Spirit as the third member of the Trinity. How is it that these first century Jews, and we have tons of evidence, both textual evidence and archaeological evidence, showing how fiercely monotheistic that they were, how is it that these first century Jews who believed that Yahweh would share his glory with no other, has now shared his glory with Jesus? Or better yet, that Jesus has had that glory all along. It's just now being revealed at the resurrection. Well, the idea that this was unthinkable to Jews is not something that people are commonly aware of. In fact, usually that's something that's reserved for like high-level discussions in scholarship and things that are written in scholarship or discussions in scholarship. What most people, and this is what you may have heard about this, understand is that it would be blasphemous for somebody to claim that a person, a human being, was divine. Or it would be blasphemous just for a human being to kind of tread on divine prerogatives, to kind of act in a way that they were acting like God. Like, for example, when Jesus is forgiving sins and he gets accused of that. While that's true, that's really not the major thing that's going on here. The thing that is more fundamental for a first century Jew isn't that it would be blasphemous, punishable by death, a capital offense, but that calling a human being God, thinking that the eternal, infinite God could become a human being, was unthinkable. It was inconceivable. In fact, we have records of where Jews looking at their pagan neighbors who did believe that the gods could become human, they didn't accuse them first and foremost of blasphemy. What they accused them first and foremost of was how ridiculous that idea was. It was just ludicrous, laughable to them because it was so inconceivable. That mindset was driven home to me a few years ago, a few Thanksgivings ago. We're so familiar with the incarnation, with the idea of Jesus being God incarnate, that living in this kind of Christian culture, most of us don't really understand how illogical that is. But a couple Thanksgivings ago, it's driven home to me how absurd it actually appears. At Thanksgiving dinner at my cousin's, she had invited a friend of hers, somebody that she had befriended during that year. She invited her and her family to come to our Thanksgiving dinner. She happened to be, this friend of my cousin's, an Orthodox Jew. As we sat down for dinner and started talking, making niceties and everything, I found out that she was very enamored with education. She made that very clear, maybe for the benefit of her children who were started the college application process. But she was also very much into like the top schools. Like she was well versed in them and very interested in them. So when she turned and asked me where I had gone to school, and I explained, where I went to college and then graduate school, and she found out the graduate school I went to, which happened to be like her favorite school, it's a well-known Ivy League school, she all of a sudden like held me in the highest esteem possible. It became turned to me, was very interested in me, until a few breaths later, when she asked me what I did for a living, and I explained that I'm a pastor and I'm a Christian, she was absolutely perplexed, dumbfounded, and she wouldn't let it go. She kept asking me, how can you, who went to this school, who appeared to be intelligent, how could you possibly believe that God could become a human being? How could you believe in the incarnation? How can you be a Christian? And throughout that meal, I didn't get to eat much turkey that Thanksgiving. She kept forcing me to kind of defend or explain that. And I was trying in as graceful and lucid a way as possible, but none of that worked for her, to explain how I could possibly believe that God, the infinite God, could become a finite human being. She actually was almost like berating me over that. It appeared so illogical to her. She just couldn't believe that I could believe that. And she wasn't doing it in a mean way, if that makes sense. She wasn't berating me in a mean way, but she just found it so ridiculous, so utterly ridiculous, that any person, especially a person of some apparent intelligence, she thought I had, could actually believe this nonsense. She got it. She understood that first century mindset. She understood the mindset of Thomas and Peter and Mary Magdalene and the rest of those early disciples who were fiercely monotheistic first century Palestinian Jews. So how is it that these fiercely monotheistic Jews ever came to believe that God could take flesh in Jesus? For them, I know this analogy may seem like a little bit of a stretch, but go with me on this. For them, it would have been like pouring the ocean into a bottle. I live near Long Island Sound, And I often during the week will take a couple of walks, my wife and I, to the beach. And I look out at Long Island Sound, and it's this vast expanse of beautiful blue water. A couple years ago, they were talking about how there were shark attacks off of Long Island, and they were warning us that the beach we go to, there's a chance that there could be sharks in those waters. So as I look out at that vast expanse, I think about all the sea life that's contained in all that water. The idea of pouring that water, just Long Island Sound, into a bottle is ludicrous. I mean, it's ridiculous to think that even one shark that's in their waters could actually fit into a bottle. And yet, Long Island Sound is just a fraction of the ocean. The ocean is, quote unquote, infinitely greater than Long Island Sound. So how do you get the ocean into a bottle? If for you that seems like a stretch, seems absurd, seems like I'm being over dramatic, think about this. That's not even close to the incompatibility of an infinite God, a truly infinite God. The ocean is finite after all, but a truly infinite God somehow being contained in a finite human body, living a finite human life. That woman understood how the first disciples saw things. For them, believing that Jesus was actually God incarnate would be like actually pouring the ocean into a bottle. So the mystery remains, how is it that these first century Jews could ever come to believe that Jesus was God incarnate? One of the questions that I'm frequently asked, and one of the questions that I wondered about early on in studying all this, is how can you ever find evidence, good evidence, solid evidence, trustworthy evidence for an event that happened 2,000 years ago, an event of ancient history? Well, how do we know that the Big Bang happened? Nobody was there to videotape it. Nobody saw it. Nobody was alive to witness it. The way we know is because it has left measurable effects, like background infrared radiation, for example. It's one of the measurable effects that scientists, astrophysicists point to say that we can be certain that the Big Bang happened, even though nobody was there to witness it. We don't have absolute perfect certainty because nobody could see it, because we don't have a videotape of it. But there's the highest degree, highest level of certainty that it did happen, because it's the only way to explain these measurable effects. Well, while the discipline of history is very different than the discipline of astrophysics, there's a similar way in which we can kind of measure the effects of history. There are measurable effects that can give us different degrees of certainty about things that happen even in the ancient past. And one of the most certain measurable effects of history, at least in the study of religions, is what happens to these early disciples. Using the scientific criteria of historicity, it can be easily established that very soon after Jesus' death, probably in the immediate wake of, like perhaps weeks, maybe even days of his death, these early Christians, these first century monotheistic Jews, came to believe that he was God incarnate. The way that people normally understand that happen is by pointing to the resurrection, which is right. It could only happen if Jesus rose from the dead. But what we often miss in that is that if Jesus simply rose according to their expectation, if he appeared to them in the form and manner they expected, they didn't expect resurrection to happen until the end of the age, during the general resurrection when it would happen to everybody, but that's a whole other argument for another day. But if they were to imagine what the resurrection body would look like, they had a couple of pretty vivid images in their minds, some understandings from the Old Testament, from their experience. However, in order for them to believe that Jesus was God incarnate, they needed far more than that. If Jesus just appeared the way they expected the resurrection body to look, they would have thought of it as vindicating him as the Messiah, as a human Messiah. Nothing more than that. It would have been great and glorious, but they would have finally believed their Messiah had come, even though in this strange way of having to die on a cross first. They would have believed that he was the forerunner for resurrection, even though it would be kind of very weird, very unthinkable for them that he had been resurrected before everybody else. That's how they would have understood it. For them to get to divinity, to understand Jesus as divine, though, they would have had to see something in these appearances that the big word scholars use is theophanic. They would have to be theophanic appearances. That word theophanic comes from theophany. It's a word which means a manifestation of God's glorious presence. In the Old Testament, there are a number of theophanies, like the burning bush is one of them, where God appears. And there are ways, signals for a first century Jew that would tell them that this is God appearing, like when the cloud overshadows Peter, James, and John at the Transfiguration, and they think they're dead because they're in the presence of God. That's another theophany of God, manifestation of his glorious presence. So there had to be something in Jesus' appearance, his resurrection appearance, that told him, that told them that he was God, signaled that he was God. There had to be something theophanic. What was that? Well, the Gospels give us precious little detail about how Jesus looked, the form and manner of his resurrection appearances. But they do give us clues. And one of the most powerful clues is what happens with Jesus' body. If you read that story of doubting Thomas, you notice that Jesus just appears in the midst of the disciples when he appears to Thomas. The doors are locked because they're afraid that they're next. They're going to be the next to be crucified. So they have the doors locked, and Jesus just appears in the upper room. His body just materializes in front of them. Scholars refer to that as the glorified body. Jesus has a real physical body, but it's transformed to the transcendent sphere. It transcends space and time. So even though it's physical, somehow it kind of has the marks of transcendence. In other words, unlike any other heavenly beings besides God, Jesus seems to have that ability of transcendence, that glory, as something that is intrinsic to who he is, intrinsic to his nature, to his person. Another clue that the Gospels give us is that in many of the instances where Jesus appears, at first, his disciples don't recognize him. They come to recognize that it's Jesus, but there's something odd about him, something strange, something other. In fact, in John chapter 21, they almost want to do like a science experiment on him. He looks so strange, even though they know it's Jesus. It says that none of them dared ask, dared inquire about him, that it was really him. That the Greek there, exotazo, really implies an interrogation. Like they wanted to interrogate him. They just weren't sure like what he was now. He's like a different order of being. So whatever it was, those are some clues to give us an idea. The glorified body that Jesus had that transcended space and time, the sense that the glory of God, God's glory, was something intrinsic to his being. Those are clues for us. But we don't even need to know exactly, because all we need to know is that whatever they saw in him, in his resurrection appearances, would have been just as impossible for them to conceive as his divinity. The only thing that could get them to that quantum leap of understanding, to believe that he was divine, is something of a similar magnitude. And whatever that was, it had to be just as unthinkable, inconceivable, unimaginable for them. And based on, and here's the upshot of all this, based on what we know about alternate states of consciousness, hallucinatory experiences, they just don't work like that. You can't exceed the content of the mind, of your psychosocial, cultural conditioning. For a first century Jew to imagine that a human being was God, based on these resurrection appearances, as they claim, means that those resurrection appearances had to be utterly unthinkable to them, something that their minds could not conjure up. And if their minds couldn't conjure them up, then they had to be real appearances of a real Jesus, really resurrected from the dead in a glorified body that transcended space and time. There's only one alternative explanation left among scholars, among the experts who study the resurrection. For those who don't believe it was a miracle, the only explanation they have is that it was some form of hallucinatory experience, some form of altered state of consciousness the disciples were in that caused them to imagine Jesus appearing to them. But that alternate explanation just doesn't work, given what they say, the measurable effect that we are very certain of, that they say about Jesus being divine, coming to believe that he is their Lord and their God. The only way to explain that is that it was something way beyond their imagination, something objective, something real, not something they conjured up in their minds. And that's why we can be very certain. We don't have absolute or perfect certainty in Jesus rising from the dead. You can't find that in most things in life. You can't find that even with a lot of the underpinnings of science, like the Big Bang. But we can have the highest level of certainty, almost virtual certainty, as some scholars have argued, that Jesus truly appeared to those disciples in an objective way, a supernatural way, a miraculous way. They appeared to them risen from the dead. I hope and pray that you had a most awesome Easter, and that now in the afterglow of Easter, you are experiencing the presence of the risen Lord. And if you are struggling in believing that he's real, I invite you to keep diving into the evidence because it is so good. But I also invite you to challenge him like Thomas did, to say, Lord, if you're really out there, show me. Because he will, one way or another. Everybody has an individual journey he guides them on, and way he reveals himself to. Maybe it's through the evidence, like me as a skeptic needed the evidence, or maybe it's just by a personal encounter where you know that he is more real than the air that you breathe. But that's the end game. That's the ultimate goal, is to know him in that personal way, where he reveals himself in a profoundly personal way to you, which he will do if you ask him, if you want that, if you open your heart to the possibility that that could be the ultimate truth, the ultimate reality. If you have any comments or questions you'd like to share, go to the Raising Jesus page of the Contact EJ page of the Raising Jesus website, and please leave them there. I'd love to hear from you.